Time travelers, get ready. There's a few things that I posted to the art classroom. We have a lot of slides to look at today, and that's basically because I want to talk about a lot of photography concepts so that as we go into our photography final project, you are armed with the most powerful photography vocabulary, tools, and knowledge. So we're going to start with appropriation and color. These are kind of an art historically relevant photography concepts. It includes a lot of things for you to kind of keep in mind and practice as you continue to take photographs, not just for this class, but in life. Appropriation, color, and composition. So let's talk about appropriation. What is appropriation? I give a definition here. Appropriation is the action of taking something for one's own use, typically without the owner's permission, right? When we think of appropriation in terms of culture, we're thinking of like when white people put locks in their, like dreadlocks in their hair, right? Or wear dashikis, or kente cloth, right? These are the things we kind of associate with appropriation. That's kind of what we think about when we think about appropriation. But in art, it's a thing that happens all the time, and it's been going on for centuries, if not millennia. We're not going to dwell on the topic too long, but I wanted to give you a few examples, let you decide how you feel about it. These are things that we have looked at briefly during our modern and contemporary art history units. So it could be said that Duchamp's ready-mades relied on appropriation since he appropriated store-bought objects into his artworks, right? So we're kind of getting away from that that cultural idea of appropriation and more into the industrial idea of appropriation, right? Barbara Kruger is possibly the inventor of the modern meme format. She appropriated photographs from print media and then superimposed text on them to convey direct messages of social criticism, sometimes with witty or snarky little remarks, right? So Barbara Kruger. This is Richard Prince. He first gained recognition for photographing ads, such as those containing the famous Marlboro cigarettes cowboys. In later years, he captured Instagram posts and indeed made appropriated artwork out of them. Sherry Levine, of course, appropriated a lot of famous photography from the WPA era, like Walker Evans, Edward Weston, who you should also check out. She also appropriated Richard Prince's appropriations. So we're really getting into the snake eating its own tail here. This isn't a graded assignment, but you should try it sometime. If you can say you've done this, it's going to give you a greater understanding of how this particular art process, art concept works. Take some time to take some time to find a photograph that appeals to you artistically. Consider composition, color, contrast, and subject matter. How can you use your camera, not a scanner or a screenshot, but your camera, to take a picture of the photograph so that it becomes something new? How can you use your camera to take a picture of the photograph so that it becomes something new? We're talking about putting the photo in a new context. So it might be a philosophical process that you go through. It might be a technical one involving your camera. It's kind of open-ended at this point as far as art history is concerned. While you're giving your brain some time to wrap itself around that idea, let's move on to color photography. Color photography. Color photography was enabled by technological developments in photographic image capturing over 100 years ago. It took another 50 plus years for color photographic technology to become cheap enough that most photographers could use it. So that's putting us into toward the center or the middle of the 20th century. Before that, artists would hand tint photographs by applying paints or dyes to black and white photographs. The results often approximated real color, but were sometimes also wildly imaginative or just plain inaccurate. This is Christina in Red, 1913. So this photo, just to give you an idea, was shot at the beginning of World War I. And that is a color photograph. It is not hand tinted. It's a very nice picture. Ryan points out it looks like a modern photo. I agree. And that's what color photography really does, is because it kind of it evokes that sense of the contemporary, because we are so used to seeing color photographs, right? This is a 1907 photo by Louis Lumiere, who, together with his brother, I believe, were some of the pioneers in motion picture filmmaking. This one obviously is hand tinted. How can you tell? Yeah, the trees are kind of black and white. They've been left untinted. The color is just not very realistic. The dress is one plain pink, while the hands have been given a kind of orange color. Yeah, some colors are more vibrant than others. They did very well to pick out all those individual yellow flowers. But otherwise, there's only been a handful of colors used here. It could even be that this is a hand-tinted, partially color photograph. I'm not sure. It looks like it's been hand-tinted to me. We talked about the rule of thirds briefly last week. The rule of thirds is perhaps the most important and most famous principle of photographic composition. It suggests that slight asymmetry strengthens composition by directing the eye deeper into the field of view. In the image to the right, you can see a few examples of photos composed using the rule of thirds with a grid showing how the composition is divided into thirds. And some of you have already started exploring the rule of thirds in your assignments. And the rule of thirds can apply regardless of whether you have a rectangular composition or a square one, even if you have compositions that are not even rectangular, but maybe, circular or oval, the rule still applies. Basically, the idea is that you're dividing your composition into equal parts that get away from symmetry, right? If your composition was symmetrical across a center line of symmetry, what you'd see is the same thing on both sides. But instead, with the rule of thirds, what you see is the balance is thrown a little bit off in a way that we have started to recognize is still aesthetically pleasing, right? So that's kind of the basic principle. And of course, these rules are made to be broken. I want you to explore the rule of thirds with the end goal of innovating upon it. But, so as I said, yeah, it's made to be broken. There's a video attached to the slideshow that I'm not going to play right now, but it's in there. This is on the classroom for my students. Go ahead and check out 10 Myths About the Rule of Thirds, an educational film by Tavis Leaf Glover, which I don't think I've even watched it since last year when I originally made this slide presentation. But it's good to always question these kind of artistic rules. Most of the time you're going to find out that they're wrong. Okay, so foreground, midground, background. This is a concept you're probably already familiar with. Stick your finger up in front of your face about a foot away. I'm now about, okay, so I've got my finger about a foot away from my face and a foot away from my computer camera. Focus your eyes on your finger, and then focus your eyes on the wall or object in the distance. Then focus back. Try it with one eye closed. The difference between the wall and your finger is the principle of foreground and background. With a camera, the difference ends up being expressed by the blur or sharpness caused by focusing a single lens. So the focal distance between the lens of your eye and your retina is much shorter, so you get a slightly different effect. It's hard to see blurry unless you actually have a shape issue with your retina, which is what people like myself who are nearsighted would have, right? So if I take my glasses off like this and I look more than, I don't know, a foot away from me, things start to get a little blurry. In landscape photography, the differences between foreground, middle ground, and background often manifest in terms of saturation, hue, and value rather than focus. This is because of a phenomenon called atmospheric perspective. Atmospheric perspective. The fancy Italian painter word for this, by the way, is sfumato. Sfumato. What's actually happening is the effect of perspective. So that's, again, remember way back at the beginning of the year, the phenomenon that causes things closer to you to appear larger and things that are farther away to appear smaller, right? That's perspective. So that effect is happening to the air particles in the planet's atmosphere. In the distance, the particles appear smaller and also closer together, which is why they actually obscure the detail of the landscape behind them. In the image on the left, the mountains are all covered in the same brown scrub bushes as the hillside in the foreground, but they appear blue in the distance because they are losing their saturation and taking on the hue of the sky, which is the same atmospheric particulates causing the change in color. So if you think of our atmosphere as like, remember, it's a gas. We breathe a combination of nitrogen and oxygen and a few other things, and that's a gaseous mixture that makes up our atmosphere. And if you think of a gas, you can think of it as being kind of murky, right? So the more of it there is, the more you have to look through, right? And the less visibility you have as distance becomes greater. Think about swimming in like a lake, a murky lake. So like you can see pretty well, you know, with your arm in front of you, but it could be that 10, 12, 20 feet, you don't see that well, right? Same idea. I included a few tips here for just taking better photos because you're going to be taking a lot of photos in the next couple weeks. First of all, I want you to be aware of what's inside your frame and how everything inside your frame is arranged. Think of your composition like a work of formal abstraction, right? Think about like a Barnett Newman or a Mark Rothko or something like that, with shapes of color, light, and shadow that make a pattern to direct the eye. Crop your composition so that you get exactly what you want in the frame. Another thing that you should start doing when you're taking photos for the sake of creating art, take multiple shots under slightly different conditions and angles, and then choose the best one. Especially with digital photography, there doesn't have to be a limit to how many photos you can shoot. So why not take more so that you have the best one to choose from, rather than just trying to get like the photograph on the first try? Not likely to happen. So make sure that you're taking a photo and then thinking, okay, what can I do differently to improve this? Take another photo. Okay, now let's try it from here. Take another photo. And then what you end up with is maybe instead of 1 or 2 photos, you end up with 20 or 30 photos. You can look through all of them, choose the best one, and then that is your artwork. And that's how professional photographers work. Except in many cases, 20 or 30 is very far from the number that they shoot in order to get the one that ends up being framed, right? Whenever possible, do your work in camera. In other words, put lots of effort into setting up your photos and getting the framing just right so that you don't have as much or anything to do in the editing phase. All right, so those are some tips for taking better photos, which I do expect to see reflected in the quality of your work as we continue with this unit. We're coming up close now to the point where we are going to be talking about final projects for photography and transitioning into motion picture. Okay, so as we do that, I want you to continue thinking about this workflow because it's going to be really helpful for you in order to create higher quality work. You have an assignment this week. It kind of accompanies this slide presentation. Light and shadow. Creating interesting photographs by concentrating on light contrast. Contrast. What does contrast mean in general? Contrast is when two things are the opposite of each other. Indeed, indeed. And so what does contrast mean in terms of light and shadow in an image? Yeah, we're seeing parts that are lighter, some parts that are darker. How dark something is compared to something else in the image. So we're now looking at a comparison, right? We're starting to see more than one area of an image, one area that is light, one area that is dark, and we are making observations about those two areas and trying to perhaps qualify or even quantify the differences. This is called pepper number 30. It is shot by Edward Weston in 1930. I have a question up here which I don't expect you to be able to answer yet unless you have a lot of photographic vocabulary already. What is the dynamic range in this photograph? Ryan says it looks not so pepper-like. Indeed, let's talk about that for a second. What does this look like? If not pepper-like, what does it look like? These are all fair and valid assessments of what you're seeing, and very intentional on the part of Edward Weston. He was definitely trying to evoke a sense of something beyond just a pepper. So the dynamic range, what is dynamic range? Dynamic refers to the amplitude or intensity of light and shadow in a composition. Just by itself, the word dynamics refer to a range of amplitude or intensity. How many of you are musicians here? In music, dynamics refer to how loud or soft the sound is, right? So if you think of it as wavelengths, you've got the loud part up here and the soft part down here. Loud, soft, loud, soft. And in visual images, dynamics refer to how bright or dark something is. Light and shadow, light and shadow. So the dynamic range refers to the difference between the lightest and darkest areas or points in a composition. And Janice points out there's a huge difference from the lightest part and the darkest part of the photo. That is because this photo has a very wide dynamic range. It is a high contrast image. What is the relationship between dynamic range and contrast? Janice is correct. She said a wide dynamic range results in higher contrast. And how are the values within that range distributed throughout this composition? If you were to plot them on a chart, where you have the dark ones here and the light ones here, what would be the shape of that chart? They're not focused in one point, that's correct. So we see some areas of highlight kind of all over the composition. What else? Is it mostly light or mostly dark? Or is it mostly kind of mid-tones? When you look at this photo, do you get a sense that you're sitting in darkness, or do you get a sense that you're sitting in light? Yeah, we're seeing a lot of darkness. Even though, actually, if we look carefully, there is quite a lot of light in the composition. But overall, this is a dark photograph. And what effect does that distribution of values create? In other words, how does it make you feel when you look at this image? What does it evoke? Janice says sad, solemn. Ronnie types an ellipsis, weird, eerie. So we're starting to get some emotional resonance just from a pepper, which normally would be quite neutral, but what we're getting it from then is the dynamic range, the sense of light and dark in this composition. So light and shadow can have a lot of different meanings, right? Here's a self-portrait by Peter Hugo, one of my favorite photographers. This was done in 2011, 2012. Peter Hugo is a white South African photographer. Much of his work deals with how he, as a white South African, sees and is seen by Black Africans and the racial conflicts that continue to define life in that part of the world. In real life, Hugo is a very pale person and has light-colored hair. He used special film and lighting effects to take this photograph and a series of others in such a way that the white subjects look dark and the black subjects look very light. So I'm not 100% sure. I haven't read up on how he did this, but I have two theories. One is that he's using infrared film, which means that it's picking up on things the light is doing that our naked eyes can't see. So that's why you're seeing a lot of like freckles and stuff on his skin that normally would be very pale. They get augmented in the infrared photo. The other possibility, and you should definitely try this, do any of you possess a black light? That is an ultraviolet light, like the kind that they use to find stains on stuff. So at some point, try turning off all the lights in your room except for the black light, lighting yourself with the black light, and taking a black and white photo of yourself. It's going to look like this. It's something I tried in college and I really want to get back to because it looks so interesting. So here's a few other examples from the series. Everyone's saying it looks kind of scary, looks like a mugshot. Sure. What about these is making it look like a mugshot? The expression, the lighting, yeah, for sure. The fact that the subjects are kind of facing the camera expressionless, more or less, right? With their eyes open. They've been posed as if they've just been asked to stand against a wall and that's it, right? They're very symmetrically composed. And you can feel the seriousness. Definitely getting a sense of weirdness too because of that weird lighting effect. The creepiness of maybe the fact that whatever is happening with the lighting, it is causing their eyes not to be darker than the skin, which is what we're accustomed to seeing in a face, right? Normally when you look at a person's face, if they don't have a beard, let's say, right? The darkest spots are going to be like their two eyes and maybe their nostrils and their mouth. But here, the eyes are kind of missing because they're so light colored because of whatever effect is happening with the photo. And then it seems Peter Hugo also found some black subjects, these two are children, with either abnormal pigmentation, so they are black people with perhaps albinism, or he's using other photo editing techniques in order to create the sense that the black subjects who we would normally think of as darker than the white subjects now appear lighter than the white subjects, right? So there's been a role reversal there. And what sense do we get from these photos? Do these also look like mugshots? Never mind that there's young kids, but are we getting a different feeling or vibe from these? Less serious. For one thing, we're getting color photos now, right? Less serious, maybe because they're kids. We don't have that association of children and mugshots, right, that we do with adults. So there's a lot going on here. Ronnie says, still looks weird to me. Yeah, maybe. Definitely some unusual looking kids. So that could be a byproduct of the infrared camera, or it could be just markings that the subject has on their face. We don't really know, but it's not important. It's more about how do we feel about these photos? Hugo is better known for his series of photographs of hyena handlers, a group of men in Nigeria who train or force hyenas and baboons to entertain crowds for money. Let's look at a couple of examples and see if we can determine how light and shadow play a role in these photographs too. Peter Hugo is very good at using light and shadow, and that's why we're looking at his work. So here's a couple of his photos of the hyena handlers. You can see the guy on the left's got a baboon, the guy on the right has a hyena. And these are people in Nigeria who are very poor. They are kind of like buskers. How many of you remember riding the train before COVID and these kids would get on and they'd say, it's showtime, and then they'd start breakdancing all over the place? So these guys are kind of like Showtime, except instead of breakdancing, they have wild animals on chains. What do we see in the way that these photos are composed? What can we say about these compositions? Talking about light and dark, what do you notice? Yeah, Bingji, that's right. The light background on the right makes the person in the foreground stand out. He is mostly dark. He's like an island of dark area in the composition against a very light sea or background, right? And yeah, that's the hyena that he's kind of straddling there. What about the one on the left? Yeah, we've got a lighter figure. And how is the composition arranged? Would you say he's using the rule of thirds, or is he doing something else? Let's talk about symmetry. Yeah, definitely breaking the rule of thirds. Are these compositions symmetrical? Are we seeing symmetry here? What kind of devices are we using to see how these photos are composed? Ronnie, it looks like something in a movie or magazine. Yeah, for sure. And Peter Hugo has done quite well in recent years and has been approached to kind of elevate some of these works into something that is more in line with fashion and advertising. And I think that has actually happened a few times. How is contrast being used in this photo? Let's simplify the areas of color to understand how it's working. So what I did was I plugged this into Google Drawings and I overlaid polygonal shapes on top of it, just so that we could more clearly see what the shapes of color were doing in the composition. We're starting to get more abstract. We're getting away from the rule of thirds for sure, but we're also not symmetrical. What kind of compositional elements are being used here? How is he directing our eye around the composition? Janice says, my eyes are more drawn to the baboon than the dude. Why do you think that is? And why do you think that is in terms of the composition? Not the subject matter, but the composition. Yeah, it's a baboon. Yeah, we don't see baboons very often, so we look at them when we do see them, right? But what is Peter Hugo doing to make you look at the baboon? So the baboon is a dark spot surrounded by a lighter spot. It has contrast against its background. Albert says, my eyes are drawn to the light, and that draws me to the guy's face since it's contrasting. Makes it pop out more. Look at this shape right here in the kind of upper right-hand quadrant. That acts like an arrow along with this one and this one. So the perspective of that like overpass that he's standing under draws you in toward the center of the composition. So what we start looking at a lot are the guy's hand holding the chain, and we follow that chain down to the baboon. This area of light is pointing us right toward the baboon's head. And it's not an accident. Experienced artists will do this stuff on purpose to make you look at some part of the composition to actually control how you see their work. You have an assignment this week. You have an assignment this week. It is to take a black and white portrait. Take a photograph in black and white or change to black and white afterwards that meets the following criteria. It's got to be a portrait. It depicts a person. It depicts a person. It depicts a person. It depicts a person in such a way that it communicates something important about who they are, what they're like, etc. So it's not just a picture of a person, it is a picture about a person. A portrait is a picture about a person. I'm going to leave it at that. Your photograph also must use black and white contrast to communicate something about the subject, to create a mood, and to direct the eye within the frame of the composition. So as you're doing that, consider the different effects that a wider and narrow dynamic range can create. Consider the frame. Always think about your photographs as if they were abstract paintings and you are using shapes and colors to create a visual map for your viewer. Okay? How to create a black and white photograph. Access the settings in your camera or photographic device before you shoot your photographs. The other thing that you can do is convert your photograph to black and white in post-production. This means that you're using an editing tool to change the photograph after it has been shot. You can do that with Photopia. I think they want you to pronounce it Photopia. If you go to photopia.com, it's basically like a Photoshop simulator that is web-based. And it helps if you know some basic Photoshop techniques. I've made demos for that before. I will make one just to show you how to convert your photo to black and white and then mess with the contrast and maybe do some cropping. I think that would probably be helpful. Of course, you might have an in-camera photo editor. Don't highly recommend using in-camera editors because you're usually working with a screen that is no bigger than this. And therefore, you can't really see what you're doing. So I don't recommend in-camera photo editors. But if that's your only option, that's your only option. I'm also going to show you how to use Google Drawings to create a black and white photo. I put the instructions in there, but I'll include that in the demo when I make it later. Regardless of whether you set your camera to black and white before you take the picture, you can still use editing tools to enhance contrast and dynamic range, which I will show you when I create the demo. So that's it. Let's take a look at the rubric for this assignment. I've copied the instructions here. The rubric goes like this. Did you follow the instructions? Yes. It's a portrait. It depicts a person in such a way that it communicates something important about who they are, what they're like, etc. And it's a black and white photo. How carefully did you compose your photograph? Very carefully. Black and white contrast is used to communicate something about the subject, to create a mood, and to direct the eye within the frame of the composition. Nothing in the shot is random. Everything has been carefully placed within the frame. That's how you get full credit for this. Okay? And of course, I will give extra credit for photographs that are very good. If you take a wonderful photograph for this assignment, you're going to get extra credit. And I love giving extra credit. It's totally my jam. And I am going to be creating a tutorial on how to create a black and white photo using this kind of online photo editing simulator called Photopia or Photopia. I'm not exactly sure how they want you to pronounce it, but I would say Photopia makes the most sense, but they spelled it wrong. So it is what it is. We're going to go to new project. We're going to, let's see. I'm going to go ahead and find a photo to import. Let's pretend that I shot this myself. Images. Let's say I went ahead and shot a color photograph, and now I want it to become a black and white photograph. And I want it to have a kind of a mood to it. So like, here's a good photo. It has interesting lighting. When you take your photo for this project, your photo is also going to have interesting lighting. Only you're going to shoot it yourself. You're not going to find it on the internet like I did for the purposes of this demo alone. So I'm going to grab this photo, I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to paste it into Photopia. You're going to import your photo into this by going File and let's see. You might drag and drop it, edit, let's see, copy, paste, something like that. You can probably drag and drop it into Photopia. I want the image to be a bit bigger, so I'm going to go to canvas size. Let's make it relative to here, and I just want this to be about 1500 by 100 pixels, and that is going to give me a little bit more to work with here. That's very nice. Okay, so I've selected the layer where my photo is, and I want to hit transform control so that I can resize it. Holding down the shift key, I will drag a corner up, and I'm going to drag this corner here, and now I'm going to hit enter. That pretty much fixes the photo into there. I'm going to hit my crop tool, and I'm going to crop carefully because remember, I want to be aware of what's in my frame. And I want this to use the rule of thirds. Look at that. They give me a 3x3 grid here, so I can actually line up the center of his face with that 1/3 mark there. And now I'm going to hit enter. Whoops, you know what? I cropped it wrong. I want to take off that little bit at the bottom. There we go. So now I've got a nicely composed photo, which is obeying the rule of thirds. It's giving me a sense of imbalance. There's drama already in the way I lit the photo when I shot it. Remember, you want to do a lot of that work in camera before you start editing. And now I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, and Hue Saturation. That is going to bring up a menu. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take saturation, I'm going to drag it all the way to the left. That turns this into a black and white photograph. I'm going to hit OK. And now I'm going to go to Image, Adjustments, Levels. By messing with levels, I can tell the software how wide I want the dynamic range to be. So right now, this is the whole dynamic range of the photograph. I want to tell it that this should be the darkest point. So that's going to make it go from like this light gray, or sorry, dark gray to an actual black in the dark shadows. And now I've got this area which tells me that I have really white highlights. And if I don't want to have white highlights, I could drag this down. Sorry, not if I don't want to. If I want more of the things that are closer to a white highlight to be a highlight, I could drag this that way. And by decreasing the dynamic range, it basically tells me I'm getting more and more towards either this is a black area or a white area. But this is pretty good. I can slide this thing in the middle, and that's my contrast. So here I'm getting like more contrast, less contrast, right? And I like it dark here. I think that looks really great. So that his face is becoming quite a bit darker, and it's heightening that sense of drama. This is my dynamic range control here, taking away the highlights and saying the brightest highlight should only be here, or the darkest shadow should only be this dark. Generally, you can mess with that, but don't hit OK until you've got something you like, and you're able to preview it, see the difference. I'm going to hit OK. To view this larger in full screen, I'm going to hit Command 0, or View Fit the Area. And this looks like the image I want. So other things I can do to mess with it, you can go to Curves. For some reason, it's not popping up when I do that. So it's Command M. And in Curves, I can select different parts of the image to kind of adjust, and I can just do this visually. It's kind of a similar thing to levels, but you can kind of include more different parts to it and really go crazy. But I don't recommend doing anything that would make your image look unnatural, because otherwise you're going to end up with something that it starts to become distracting, right? We're now fixated more on what the weird color effects are than that sense of personality that we're supposed to be getting, because this is a portrait. So I'm going to undo that. When I'm ready to export this, I'm going to go to File, Export As, and I'm probably just going to use a JPEG. You can use PNG as a pretty good format. JPEG is fine. Don't do a GIF. Don't do a PDF. Bitmaps and TIFFs are probably higher resolution than you need for this assignment. JPEG is going to be sufficient. And you would export that and then upload that for your assignment. I'm going to exit this without saving. And I'm going to show you how to do this in Google Drawings. And I'm going to, I've got my person on the clipboard still, I believe. So I'm going to go ahead and paste him right in there. And we are going to format options with the image selected. We are going to recolor. We are going to select this one, grayscale. And in adjustments, we can slide brightness and contrast around. So it's a simpler tool set, but essentially doing the same thing. Very, very easy to use. What else? We can also crop, of course, using the crop tool. Let's crop. Whoops. I see. We're cropping the selected image. So if I want to crop this, I can drag this guy over like that. It's not showing us that grid like we had in Photopia, but that's okay. Then I unselect crop, and that is my image that I can now attach or upload to my assignment. Okay, so I'm looking forward to seeing what you create. If you have questions, please write them here in the class comments. That way everyone can see them and I don't have to go through the private comments repeating myself. It is now time for you to go to your second period class. Everybody, thank you so much for time traveling with me. I will see you. Ciao.